Okay, video people, you need to take notes on the lecture today. First, I'm going to hand out, we're going to basically be talking some about the Renaissance, especially about European rulers, since that seems to be something that didn't spend as much time learning in Mystery of History. Those of you who have done Mystery of History. All right, so I've split them out into the different countries that they're from. As you can see, England is always hard to keep track of because it's always a first and a second and a fourth and a sixth and an eighth, and so it gets complicated. You'll notice that in 1685 we have William III and Mary II. Anybody know what's named after them? Right near here? The College of William and Mary, yes, named after them. So, okay, but we're not going to talk so much about them because that's farther ahead in history. Let's see. So, y'all have the back, right? You have the back? Yeah, this page? Okay. So these are the top is the people that were the leaders in Florence, which is where the Renaissance began, pretty much. We talk about the Italian Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance began mostly in Florence. All right. Oh, this pen. Begins in Florence. And the word Renaissance, remember what it means?
Rebirth.
Rebirth, exactly. Rebirth of culture and science and art and music and all of those things. And so the other city-states of Rome are mentioned on this paper as well. So you have Florence where it began, which was ruled by the Medicis. The Medici family. They were great patrons of the arts, great supporters of artists like who? Two of the most famous Renaissance artists that came out of Florence. It's right there in your paper, if you're on this side. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, right. Leonardo's, da Vinci just means from Vinci. That's just his city, but we refer to him as Leonardo da Vinci. So yeah, they were definitely great supporters of that, as well as being the beginning of banking in Florence. So we have these kind of two parallel tracks going on here with all of the arts and the sciences, as well as the financial piece with the banking beginning as well. And then we have Milan, which was ruled by the Sforza family. That's a Z, not a 2 or a snake. And then Venice. Venice had a whole lot of, Venice did not have a family that ruled it. It had a series of leaders that were called doges, D-O-G-E, not dogs, but doges. They were kind of like the duke of the city-state. They were in charge of it. They didn't have a king necessarily, but they had a duke. But Rome was a little different because Rome was run by the Pope. He was the head of the church and the head of Rome. And I don't know what to do with this camera, but we'll do our best. Okay, and then Naples was ruled, it's southern Italy, and there's a guy named Alphonse the First. You ever heard of the term Neapolitan? Neapolitan means it comes from Naples. And again, Alfonso is another one of these rulers. He was a conqueror. He conquered the city of Naples, and then he went on to support the writers and the artists and the philosophers. And Naples also became known for its music, and it's known also for having been the place where the mandolin was invented, basically taking a lute and adapting it to the instrument that we now call the mandolin. But then Naples was captured by Spain in 1504 and became a whole separate part. It was not Italy. Italy does not become an actual country for a very long time, hundreds of more years before Italy is united as a country. All right, so then we're going to shift away from the Italian Renaissance. After the Italian Renaissance, we see the Renaissance arriving in England. So we're going to look at the English Renaissance for a second. Okay, so the English Renaissance, of course we know one of the greatest authors of the English language, which we just talked about in lit class, is Shakespeare. He is part of the English Renaissance. But we're going to look at the actual rulers that were in charge of England during the Renaissance, right from the beginning all the way on through. But there was another ruler outside of England who was the Holy Roman Emperor, right? We know what the Holy Roman Emperor is. It's not an empire. It's not holy. It's not Roman. And it's not really an empire. It's actually mostly the German city-states, the area of the world that we would call Germany now. At this point, that's where the Holy Roman Emperor is ruling over. So during this period of history, a guy named Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor. V for the Roman numeral 5, right? So Charles V, the interesting thing is he also ruled over a part of France that was called Burgundy, like the wines, where it comes from actually. So the Burgundian territories were also ruled over by Charles V. He also was what was called the King of Castile and Aragon, which are two important parts of Spain, okay? And he's the king at this time of Naples and the island of Sicily, part of Italy, or the Italian area, the Italian states. He's also the Archduke of Austria and the King of Germany. So he's ruling a whole lot of Europe at this point. Most of it not including England, okay? So his grandparents were people we have heard of before. His grandparents were Ferdinand and Isabella. What did they do? They sent Columbus. They paid. They were the only rulers willing to believe that Columbus had a good idea, and they paid for him to go. His other grandparents one was the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy from France, which is how he got those territories. His cousin at this point is Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon is currently the Queen of England, married to King Henry VIII of England. His cousin is Mary I of England, who will marry his son, Philip II, who will become the King of Spain. He's the King of Spain when Mary, the Queen of England, marries him, which is very unpopular in England because the English and the Spanish don't like each other at all. But so he's related to all of these people. And during his reign, what was called New Spain, which is in the New World, both North, South America, and the Caribbean, was considerably extended by his conquistadors. He's the one sending these guys out who defeat the Maya and the Aztec and the Incas. All right, so he's getting all this wealth from there. And he's the guy that sends Magellan. Anybody remember what Magellan did? He was the first person to do something. Yes, circumnavigate the globe, sail all the way around the world, although he didn't survive to make it home, but one of his ships did. So all of these things. So he's related to all these people. He has all these important things happening in the New World, and then this ship, his guy going out and navigating all the way around the world. And he had the strong impression, Charles did, that he had a divine mission to be the ruler of the world. He really believed that, and he was obviously very powerful. It's during his reign that this is the first time anyone refers to the king as His Majesty or His Imperial Majesty. In fact, Charles insisted upon it, that he be addressed that way, because he kind of sees himself as the king of everything that's important in the world, as far as he's concerned. So, was he the ruler of the world? Kind of the European part of the world anyway, plus part of the New World. The interesting thing is this dynasty that he is part of, they're all related to each other, because the practice is, whenever possible, to marry your child off to someone else of royalty. Usually, they knew better than to marry brothers and sisters, but they were fine with marrying first cousins to each other. The problem with that is if we call it inbreeding, there's not enough of a genetic pool to prevent birth defects that are genetic. So there are a lot of these people that were all related to Charles V that have deformed jaws, which was a birth defect that went through their family. As we move through time, it gets worse because they keep doing this all the way up to the age of Queen Victoria, all the way into the 1800s. And hemophilia, which is a bleeding disorder, you can't stop bleeding, is another birth defect that's passed on by this marrying because so you have to marry your cousins because where else are you going to find a prince or a princess, right? It's like there's only so many of them, and most of them are related to you through Charles V, right? So they're all related to each other, and so this becomes an issue in England. And actually, one of Queen Victoria's children was a hemophiliac. Queen Victoria's husband's first cousin, his first name, I just forgot his first name, Albert. Prince Albert, one of his first cousins was the Tsar of Russia. And the Tsar of Russia, his son, also had hemophilia and died of hemophilia. And his other first cousin was ruling Germany at the time, the Kaiser Wilhelm. So, we get all of these first cousins, these great connections, all the royalty, because they don't want any commoners in their family. It's a bad idea, just in the long run. So now we're going to look at England and what's called the Tudor dynasty. All right, the Tudor family in England, that's kind of their surname. Their last name is sort of as the House of Tudor. Anybody know what the current house of Great Britain is? What their last name is, so to speak, or what house they are? They're the House of. Anybody know? No, but that's a good guess. They're the House of Windsor, and they're named after Windsor Castle. Windsor was not actually the name that was Queen Elizabeth's name and her father's name. If we took the names of the families that they came from, her name would have been this. Oops. Nope. Saxe-Coburg Gotha. Okay. All of those names are very German. Okay. Queen Victoria's husband was German. And so this comes from his family. These are the names of the different areas in Germany where he was the Duke of, and Albert. And so this was the British family name during World War I. And being connected with Germans was not popular, right? But then World War I ended and it was okay. But then when World War II came along and Queen Elizabeth becomes the queen, not long after that, she decided we're not going to have this German name anymore. In spite of all our German heritage, we're changing the name of the family. Where our line is now going to be the Windsors, named after Windsor Castle, that very old castle that William the Conqueror started building back in 1066. She takes the name of Windsor Castle, and it's one of their family homes. It's Windsor Park is where both of the princes, Prince William and Prince Harry, got married at Windsor. So that's their name because they didn't want to be German anymore, so they changed their name. So back to the Tudors, which were before. The first Tudor king is Henry, the 7th. I need to stop putting the cap on. It's so hard to get back off. Henry the 7th is the first of the Tudor kings. And Henry has a couple of sons because, of course, only sons can inherit from their fathers in this time. And so Arthur is the oldest son, and Arthur marries Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon, who is related to Charles V through Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay, that's the connection. She's Spanish. And so, but Arthur dies fairly shortly after they've gotten married. And they have no children. So the throne passes to the younger brother, and Henry VIII becomes king. Henry VIII is famous for getting married a lot. He married 6 wives over the course of his lifetime. 6. It was 6, I promise. I'm going to tell you all 6 of them. Trying to get a male heir. He had 2 daughters, and then he finally had a son. Unfortunately, the mother of the son died from a fever after childbirth because people didn't know what caused germs. People didn't know if you helped a mother give birth with dirty hands, that it might lead to her having what they call childbed fever, and she died. So, which was sad because Henry called her his one true wife. So, but that's where I'm getting ahead of myself in the story. All right, so he married 6 times, and he also broke away from the Church of Rome. He broke away from the Catholic Church. So that's all part of the story of Henry VIII. He was a great athlete when he was young. He loved to play sports. He loved to hunt. Very vital young man. He was also an accomplished musician and author and poet. He was a Renaissance man, right? He was that kind of guy that did all of those different kinds of things. He was involved with the construction of some of the most famous buildings that still exist in London now, like Westminster Abbey in London. He started the building of that back in the day. So like I said, his elder brother Arthur had married Catherine, or Caterina, because she was Spanish. In England they called her Catherine, but her name was Caterina, youngest daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. And they were he was 15 and she was 16. So they were very young. And so when Arthur died, Henry was 11. And because his father very much wanted to have this connection with Spain, he's like, son, you're going to marry your brother's widow because we want to stay in good with the King of Spain. And we also want to stay in good with Charles V, right? I want the Holy Roman Emperor on my side. So at the age of not quite 12, he marries his brother's widow. And his father, Henry VII, had to go to the Pope, or send emissaries to the Pope, and say, is it okay if my dead son marries his widow? Because there is something in the Bible that talks about that shouldn't happen. And so Pope Julius II, who we really only care about, because he also commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. So he was important for that. And he said, okay, Henry, go ahead. You can marry your brother's widow. I give you a dispensation for that, and there will be no sin in that. And so that was all good. And so here they are, these very young people. And Queen Isabella wanted it to happen quickly. She wanted to make sure that the prize didn't get away and marry someone else. So she really pushed that this would happen, that her daughter would marry the second king. So now Catherine is married 2 men, and she's still not 14 years old. So, but the point of marrying when you're the king, the main point is to have children. That's the whole goal. And so there was a daughter. She had a daughter named Mary. Mary the First. Sometimes you might have, we're talking about Catherine of Aragon now. She had a daughter named Mary, who would later in her life become Mary the First, the Queen of England, but we'll get there later. But then there were no more children. There were some miscarriages, but there were no more children. And Henry wanted a son. That's what he was all about. So he asked the Pope, I think that we made a mistake with this whole marrying my brother's widow. Obviously, God's opposed to it, and that's why we don't have a son. I think you should give me a divorce. What he didn't mention to the Pope was that he'd fallen head over heels for a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon by the name of Anne Boleyn. So Anne Boleyn's over here in the corner. Henry's madly in love with her. This doesn't look right. I gotta look that up. That doesn't look right. Boleyn, that's right. Okay, so he really wants to marry Anne, And Anne refuses to be his mistress. She will not share his bed with him unless she's married to him. Smart girl. Which drove him crazy because he's the king and he can have any woman he wants. Right? He doesn't have to be faithful if he doesn't want to. But so she kept him, kind of on the string, if you will, refusing to be his mistress. And so he says, "Oh, please, my Pope, will you annul my marriage?" Okay? But see, the Pope is related to our friend Charles V, right? And he doesn't want to make his cousin Charles V, who is very powerful in Europe, angry. Charles V also happens to be Catherine's nephew. So it's very complicated. And so the Pope's like, no way. I'm not getting involved in that. And Henry's like, fine, don't give me a divorce. I'm giving myself a divorce and marrying Anne anyway. To do that, Henry said, well, the only way you can get a divorce is if you're the head of the church. So Henry says, great, I'm the head of the church. We have a new church. It's called the Church of England. Okay, it looks just like the Catholic Church, but we do everything in English now. It's not all in Latin. Okay, but basically, the Church of England is the Catholic Church, just without the Pope and not in Latin. So, of course, the Pope excommunicates Henry. Now, excommunication, maybe that doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's a very big deal. Because if you're excommunicated, you get none of the benefits of the church, okay? It basically means you won't get the last rites when you die, you won't go to heaven, all of these things, and you're separated from the church, because this is the only church that there is until Henry creates one. And so not only when you're king, the rules are when your king is excommunicated, your entire country is excommunicated. That means Henry is saying everyone in England can no longer be part of the church, and they can no longer take communion, and they can no longer get married in the church, and they can't be buried in the church. Their kids can't be baptized in the church anymore. So it caused kind of an uproar among the people who are very religious and very worried about, pleasing God, and the only way they know to please God is to do what the church says. So Henry's like, okay, Parliament, you need to pass a law that there's only one church in England, and it's the Church of England, and I'm in the head of it. So they do that. The Parliament does that for Henry because nobody wants to be excommunicated. And so he is declared in 1532. Parliament passes what's called the Act of Supremacy, 1534. That makes Henry the king. The head of the church. And it declares that the king is the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Okay, the king, so it's high treason now, punishable by death, to refuse to acknowledge the king as the head of the church. So if you go against this, they can put you to death. And the English were known for not putting people to death in very nice ways. Burn you at the stake. Maybe they'll chop your head off if they like you. Or they do something terrible called being drawn and quartered. And when you're drawn and quartered, you've all heard of the rack, right? Where they stretch people. So you're stretched on the rack. That's the drawn part. Then they basically start to cut you into pieces. They open up your chest. They start to cut off your arms and legs, basically just leaving your head and your torso. And then they hang you, what's left of you. So it's pretty horrible. It's torturous. And they do it, they try to keep you alive as they do it, not let you die until they hang you. It's just torture. It's awful. So people don't want to commit treason in England. They do not want to go against the king because the consequences are very severe. Plus your family will probably be excommunicated as well. He gets to marry Anne finally. And Anne is actually, interestingly enough, very interested in the Reformation and this new Protestant church. She's reading all the time about these things. So she kind of likes it that Henry has separated from the Catholic Church because that keeps her, that's a step towards Reformation, right? That's a step towards what she's been reading about all these thinkers, especially most of them are in Switzerland and Germany, about about ideas that the Catholic Church is not doing what the Bible actually says, and things like priests, if you give me money, I will give you forgiveness. Those kinds of things. They're called indulgences. When you come and you bring your money to the priest and he forgives your sin for the money. So it's like bribing the priest, sort of. But unfortunately for Anne, there was no son. She only had a daughter. This was the daughter. This was the first daughter. And Anne's daughter is Elizabeth, who will one day, she's Princess Elizabeth, but one day she'll be Elizabeth I. She'll be one of the greatest rulers of England of all of its history. They also called her, when she was queen, they called her Gloriana, because she was such an amazing queen. She also never married, so she was the Virgin Queen. Our state is named after her, after Queen Elizabeth. It's called Virginia after her. So because she was such a great Queen of England, but not yet. Now she's just a little girl who should have been a boy, as far as her father was concerned. And Anne Boleyn falls out of favor with Henry when there's no son, because she has a couple of miscarriages and there's no more pregnancies after that. A lot of people connect it to the fact that Henry may have had what they call a venereal disease, a sexually transmitted disease, and that was why a lot of these pregnancies were miscarried. He wasn't producing healthy offspring. We don't know that for sure, but it could, based on some of the symptoms he had as an older man, people believe that he may have had, like I said, one of these diseases. And so because there's no son, Henry starts to turn his attention away from Anne to another lady of the court by the name of Jane Seymour. And the Seymour family is a powerful family in England, and her brother, Thomas Seymour, serves as one of Henry's men at court. The thing is that he has a wife who's alive, who is not producing any children for him, and so one of Henry's advisors, who will advise him about a lot of things and a lot of interesting things, his name is Thomas Cromwell. He's very powerful because he's Henry's right-hand man. And Thomas Cromwell says, I have an idea. I know you want to marry Jane, but what are we going to do about Anne? He says, let's arrest her on charges of witchcraft. He says, and then we can also, accuse her of having been adulterous with other people. And Henry's like, all right, do what it takes. And Cromwell takes it pretty far, including accusing her of being unfaithful to Henry with her own brother. All of these charges were trumped up against her. She, as far as we know, there was no real proof to any of it other than people will lie when they believe their life is in danger, especially when it's just, the King of England, the head of the church, and his wife who can't have a son. Okay, it's like if you want me to say, I heard this rumor, or I heard somebody say that she was doing this, I'll say it to save my own neck. And so Anne was convicted of, and the last of the charges that Cromwell came up with was conspiring to kill the king himself, which of course Anne never did. Anne loved him. She talked about how she loved him in her writings, but that was treason. So if you're attempting to kill the king, the only outcome is your death, is being executed. So Anne was condemned to death, as was her brother. Her brother was beheaded fairly quickly. Anne was actually, Henry, it's really interesting, Henry treated her very well in death. He allowed her to have a private execution, not be, all the public watching and jeering, and to have an execution he actually paid for a French swordsman to come over to England to do the execution. And at her execution, she made a short speech, and then instead of putting her head down on the block, since she was the queen, they didn't humiliate her. She was allowed to sit up straight and be blindfolded, and then the French swordman would just do it with her sitting upright. But she... Doesn't that make it harder? No, because he's really strong and has a very sharp sword. So it's faster. I know it's still
Well, it's
left.
just like sideways instead of just straight
So,
down, so it's kind of.
I
like,
think it's from her back to the front, and I think he's trained to do these things. But she actually said a prayer that was written down by a number of people before he actually executed her. She said, "To Jesus Christ, I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." Those were her last words. So, I mean, you know, she believed, and she was very much like interested, as I said, like in seeing reform in the church and see people not, you know, caught up in these paying for forgiveness and those sorts of things. And then the swordsman, because he was so moved by what she said, he said out loud, he said, "Where is my sword?" So that she would think there was a little more time, and then cut her head off immediately as soon as he said it. So it's like trying to give her mercy, that she wouldn't know it was coming and it would be over before she knew it. And within days, Henry marries Jane Seymour. And so now Henry goes to Parliament and says, "You need to pass an act of Parliament that says that Elizabeth and Mary, my daughters, are illegitimate. That those were not legal marriages." Even though he's the one who went through all the trouble to find a way to make them legal, he declared both of his daughters that they were not in the line of succession. They would not be able to inherit the throne. He marries Jane Seymour, and in less than a year, she gives birth to a son, finally, Prince Edward, who will later become King Edward. At last, Henry has the son he's been waiting for, but sadly, Jane dies just 2 weeks later. Childbed fever, they called it. It was probably having to do with the midwives not having clean hands as they reach in to get the baby. She gets an infection. But Henry had all of the court mourn for a month after she died. They all had to go into mourning for a month, which neither of his other wives did he even blink an eye at. He considered her to be his only true wife, and she was the one who gave him the son that he so desperately wanted. So this is Henry's only son, Prince Edward. He was not a very healthy child. He was a sickly child. He often had in bed, and so Henry thought, maybe I should get married again to be sure that I have a male heir to succeed me, just in case this not quite so healthy son doesn't survive. He was probably not healthy because of that same disease that Henry had that was making it difficult for his wives to have children. So Thomas Cromwell, good old friend Thomas Cromwell, said, "We'll find a girl for you." And he suggests a woman named Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves is from the Holy Roman Empire, part of Europe. She's like part of kind of German, and that's mostly what she spoke is German. She spoke very little English. But Henry's like, "I want a portrait of her before I decide to marry her. Send the court painter there and have him paint a portrait of her." They paint a little portrait, like if you take a picture, right? And bring it back and I'll decide. So he sees the portrait. Well, apparently the portrait was very flattering because Anne was not very attractive. Later on, Henry would say she looked like a horse. And but fortunately she was smart. Okay, so he agreed to marry her, and then when she got to England, Henry he said to all she's so ugly, she's so unattractive, and but he married her because he thought maybe she can make kids or something, right? And but pretty soon Henry decides he wants to end the marriage. That he doesn't want this marriage at all. Not only though because he didn't want her. Also, there were political issues involved because her brother, the Duke of Cleves, gets into a big dispute with the Holy Roman Emperor, with Charles V. Henry wants no part of that, and he's like, "I don't want to be quarreling with Charles V." And Anne was smart. She was like, "Fine, we'll just get an annulment. We'll both agree." She testified that they never consummated the marriage. They never shared the marriage bed. The marriage was quickly annulled by the church. And the king was so grateful, he gave her a title. He called her the king's sister. And he gave her a castle that had actually belonged to Anne Boleyn. You got to love it, right? So this was Anne Boleyn's family's castle, but you can have it. And they were apparently great friends for the rest of their lives. So she was very friendly with him. And actually, it was the bringing of Anne to England that led to the end of Thomas Cromwell and his power in England. At that time, he basically got kicked out, even though he'd been advising Henry for decades. That was the end of Cromwell. And Henry meets a young lady in waiting. She's very young. She's barely 18 years old. Her name is Catherine Howard. Oh, Thomas is gone now. Bye, Thomas. Catherine Howard. Another Catherine. And Catherine Howard is a very silly young girl. And she's marrying a fat old man at this point who had a festering wound in his leg. He had a wound that would not heal, and so apparently he didn't smell very good either. And she was actually Anne Boleyn's cousin, her first cousin. And he loved this young, pretty new queen of his. But very soon she was caught with her former boyfriend and together with him. And so that was brought to the king, that the queen was found in her bedchamber with her former boyfriend before she was married to you. And very quickly she admitted it was true, and she was executed. And she was executed at the age of 18 years old. Very, very sad. Like, the poor girl. Not very smart, though. Look at Anne of Cleves. Smart. Not pretty, but smart. And Catherine Howard, a pretty young thing, but not very smart. So finally, Henry married his last wife, a wealthy widow by the name, another Catherine, Catherine Parr. But she spelled her name a little differently. Catherine Parr was in her 30s. She was a widow, and she was kind of Henry's nurse. She took care of him. She mothered him. And there was really no thought of there being any more children. But the other thing that she did is she helped reconcile Henry with Mary. I'm just going to erase Anne Boleyn up here. With Mary and Elizabeth. He convinced, she convinced him to put them back in the line of succession behind their brother Edward, because the male would always come first. And so an act of parliament put them back in the line of succession, although they never did pass an act that made them legitimate children of his. That never happened, probably because it wasn't so much longer after this that Henry dies. Henry VIII, who had been this king for all this long time and ruled over England, but is mostly known for starting his own church, which is a pretty big deal, and then having 6 wives. So now his only surviving son, Edward, becomes Edward VI. Henry is gone. And now we have Edward VI, who is a young man. The thing about Edward is a Protestant. And he is very determined that the Protestant reforms will go forward to stamp out the Catholic Church forever. Because he's too young, he's only 9 when he becomes king, so he's too young to actually rule. So his uncle, his mother Jane's older brother, Edward, who's also Edward, becomes Lord Protector. So Edward Seymour is kind of ruling alongside this child king. And both Edward and Seymour agreed that the Catholic Church should be stamped out in England, that it should be always the Church of England, because under Henry's reign, practicing Catholics were fine as long as they kind of stayed in the shadows. Like, don't make a public display of what you're doing and we're going to let you go ahead and be Catholic. But under Seymour and Edward, it was like, no, you can't be Catholic. If you're caught being Catholic, you're going to be imprisoned, because basically we believe you're trying to overthrow the king. And so it's not a very successful reign that Edward has because of the people were not happy because of the harsh reforms of the church. They also lost military control of Scotland at this time, and the economy was terrible. People were poor and starving, and so he dies young and is a young teenager, and his sister Mary becomes Queen Mary the First of England. So goodbye to Edward. How many of you have heard of Bloody Mary? This is her. And she is a Spanish princess in her mind. She was not raised at court. She was raised with her Spanish Catholic mother, sent away from court, so she's not had a lot of influence. So she is a very staunch Catholic. She believes Catholicism is the one true church and that there are no other options. And if you do not follow Catholicism, you are a heretic and you need to be dealt with. So many people were executed for trying to practice their Protestant faith that had been the only faith allowed under her brother. So imagine being English and you want to just follow the church, and now that, wait, we have that church? Okay, no, now we're on this church? What? So it was kind of like that, and that's why she's called Bloody Mary. She's the fourth monarch now of the Tudor dynasty, and she returned England back to Roman Catholicism. She, in her reign, had almost 300 religious dissenters, people opposed to Catholicism, executed. That's why she's known as Bloody Mary. She actually, when she was 2 years old, she was promised to the King of France, who wanted to marry the King of France because he wanted an alliance with England. But then that was rejected by Mary once she became queen. And she said, she went and spoke to Charles V, who was her cousin, and said, who do you think I should marry? I mean, you're the Holy Roman Emperor. You're important. And so he's like, well, certainly don't marry the King of France. He is not for you, because that wouldn't give Charles any power in England if she married the King of France. And so instead, he says, I know, why don't you marry my son? Marry my son Philip. So Philip, she marries Charles' son Philip, and he becomes her consort, the king. He was King Philip in England, although the English people hated it, didn't like it at all. Were very unhappy about it. But she never had any children. She was, as far as history says, she was never actually pregnant. At one point they thought she was pregnant, but it was shortly before she died, and they thought it was probably a tumor that was growing in her abdomen. And that was why she thought she was pregnant. And she died of some kind of tumor, cancer kind of thing. And so after Mary dies, now we're to Elizabeth, right? And I went through Mary pretty fast. Her reign wasn't that short, but it was mostly marked by this controversy with the church back and forth, and then the controversy of marrying the Spanish king. So we have Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, raised way far away from court, not even allowed to be at court most of the time. She was kind of considered by a lot of people sort of a disgrace to the monarchy because of her mother. So she was raised as a Protestant, away from court. She was also highly educated. Because she was away from court, she didn't do all the court lady things. And so her family, where she lived with, her cousins that she lived with, saw her have a great education, and she was very bright. She was very smart. She also, like her father, loved to ride horses, loved to hunt. She was athletic. So she was a pretty good place for being a queen. But again, now here we've gone from being Protestant to being Catholic to being Protestant again. But Mary was a little more relaxed about it. She allowed Catholic families to have their own mass in their own homes, never in public, but they could still practice their Catholicism, although if they were caught in public, they would be considered a spy of Rome and could be put to death, and a few people were. And so everybody wanted Elizabeth. Elizabeth was very popular. Mary was not popular. Elizabeth was very popular, and people were thrilled when Elizabeth was back. There was huge celebrations. Everybody was glad. So she became the queen in 1533. And she remained the queen until 1603. Ooh. So she was queen for a long time. Okay, she was the only queen a lot of English people knew at the time. She was called the Virgin Queen because she never married. She was called Gloriana. She was called Good Queen Bess. And she was called the Fairy Queen, which is why we talked a little bit about Shakespeare. One of Midsummer Night's Dream was kind of written for her about the Fairy Queen, who ultimately makes up with her husband and triumphs in the long run. So she will be the sixth and final monarch of the Tudor dynasty because she has no children, so there's no one after her. She reigned for 45 years, and English power grew like crazy in the world. The worldwide power of England grew like crazy. Colonies all over the world, a great navy, although not as big as the Spanish Navy, which will come up a little bit later. And so we've gone from the Renaissance England to Elizabethan England. So we have a whole new era. The whole era is named after her. The Elizabethan era. She is, oh gosh, they're not getting to see these notes. Oh well, sorry guys. She's a redhead like her father was. Henry was a redhead, so was Elizabeth. She was pretty vain, and she had the pox. She had smallpox at one point, and her face was scarred. So she always wore heavy makeup, and it was white. So there are all these pictures of her they look really strange to us, this redheaded woman, this white face with her makeup. So, but no, of course, no one's going to tell the queen that you don't look very good. So we have some of the great playwrights like William Shakespeare, but also another guy named Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson also writing great plays at this time. So now the English Renaissance, the arts begin to flourish in England. So besides Shakespeare, we have Marlowe and Ben Jonson. During Mary's Catholic reign, the theaters had been closed because it was, sinful to just go out and engage in entertainment for the sake of entertainment. But Elizabeth was a great patron of the arts. And like I said, of course, Shakespeare wrote for her. He was the queen's man, as they say. Sir Francis Drake was a navigator, was a ship's captain. And he's the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. And he is also the first non-indigenous person that we know of to discover the Golden Gate on the California coast. A beautiful opening into this beautiful harbor, because so much of the time that area is foggy and you can't even tell that there's any inlet inwards. But for Francis Drake, as far as we know, was the first Anglo person to sail into what is now San Francisco Bay. So let's see what else. Oh, and the colonization of North America, especially under Sir Walter Raleigh. There's a legend, which probably never happened, that, and maybe you've heard it. And yes, the city of Raleigh is named after him.
I was about to ask that.
Yep. That one day he was walking through the streets of London with the Queen, and there was a mud puddle, and he swirled off his cape and put it on the mud for the Queen to cross without. So it's like whether the story is true or not, he was definitely one of the Queen's favorites. And so she gave him the money to take these ships over to the New World and start a colony for her. The first colony, you may know what the first colony was? It wasn't Jamestown. What? Nope, close. Roanoke. It was Roanoke, the lost colony that we don't know exactly what happened to it. That was the first colony, and when Raleigh went back, because he had gone back to England to do business and get more money, and he came back and they were gone. And so Jamestown, like I said, Virginia, named after her, the Virgin Queen. She was just 25 years old when she became the queen, and none of the Catholic bishops in all of England would come to her house. One of the things that Henry did during his reign was basically, her father, Henry VIII, was take away a lot of the property of the Catholic Church, which is why, how many of you have seen Downton Abbey or heard of Downton Abbey? Downton Abbey was originally an abbey. It was a place where religious people lived. It was owned by the Catholic Church, and when Henry split with the church, he said, oh, well, it belongs to the Church of England now, so it's mine. And he would give these old, beautiful homes to people he wanted to do something nice for. So for his dukes, his barons, he's like, oh, you need a house here, have a house in the countryside. And they were actually old churches or monasteries and that sort of thing, which is why it's Downton Abbey. Which is not actually the real name of that house. There's another story, but that there are houses in England that are so-and-so abbey. So the one thing that Elizabeth never did, even though she was the supreme governor of the Church of England, and she ran a navy, and she ran parliament and all that, she chose to never marry, which was shocking at this era. That just a woman ruling the country. She was really, if we want to talk about Renaissance women, she was the Renaissance woman. And at one point when they were at war with Spain, she gave a speech about, yes, she was just a feeble woman, but she had the heart of a man, and she ruled like a man. And she won over the people of England to this idea you can have a queen who doesn't have a king along her side. So she was a greatly loved queen. One of the saddest things about her life was her cousin, who had actually been a friend of hers in childhood, was Mary Queen of Scots. And Mary Queen of Scots also had a claim to the English throne. And unfortunately, there were plots against Elizabeth's life by people close to Mary. We never know if Mary was actually connected with any of those plots or knew about them. But the fact was, there were people in her name trying to assassinate Elizabeth and get her off the throne, partly because she wasn't Catholic, and partly because they really felt Mary Queen of Scots had the claim to the throne. The English didn't want anything to do with Mary, partly because she grew up in France. She was supposed to marry the heir to the French throne, and then he died. She actually did marry him at like the age of 10, but then he died, so she went back. So she only spoke French for a lot of her life, but there were all these plots in her name, and so finally Elizabeth had to make the very difficult decision, because they had been correspondents over the years, writing letters back and forth, to have her executed, to end all the plotting against Elizabeth's life, which was pretty sad. So we're just going to stop right there. Good job, y'all. You focused. You took great notes. I would like to see your notes, please. Is that your note? Oh, thank goodness. If you don't mind putting your name on, turn them in. I'll get them back to you. But since I have parental request to make sure y'all know how to take notes,